In 2006, a small group of elderly American men gathered quietly outside Washington, D.C., at a public park with picnic tables and a dog run, and told their families a story most of them had kept secret for 61 years. They weren't combat veterans describing battle. They were interrogators men who had spent the final years of World War II questioning some of the most valuable German prisoners captured by the United States, at a facility so classified that its own operators were forbidden, by binding federal oath, from telling their own wives what they had done for the war effort. The park is called Fort Hunt Park today. During the war, it didn't officially exist at all. Its only address was a post office box, P.O. Box 1142. Here's what makes this more than a footnote about wartime secrecy. What those interrogators extracted sometimes through direct questioning, sometimes through hidden microphones planted in cells where prisoners spoke freely to each other. Believing no one was listening became part of a much larger, mostly still obscure body of American military intelligence, thousands of pages of first-hand German assessments of the US Army, some gathered during the war through secret interrogation, and an even larger body gathered after Germany's surrender, when the US Army made an extraordinary decision. It paid captured German generals men who had planned and led major campaigns against American and Allied forces to sit down and write detailed, analytical reports about exactly how the US Army had fought them, and why Germany had ultimately lost. Those reports still exist, thousands of them, and across a genuinely large number of them. Written independently by German officers who had no coordination with each other, a specific, recurring observation appears again and again about what actually made American soldiers different to fight against an observation that has nothing to do with numbers or equipment, and everything to do with something the German army's own command structure had spent years training its officers not to. Expect from an enemy. Why the US Army wanted German POWs talking by the time the United States entered active combat operations against Germany, American military intelligence faced a fundamental problem. It had comparatively little first-hand understanding of how the German army, the most battle-tested land force in Europe by 1942, actually fought, organised and thought. Britain had been at war with Germany since 1939 and had accumulated years of direct intelligence. The US Army, entering the European theatre later, needed to catch up fast, and prisoners of war represented one of the most direct sources of information available. Over the course of the war, the United States held roughly 400,000 German prisoners of war. The overwhelming majority in ordinary POW camps spread across the American interior, held under standard Geneva Convention protections, put to work on farms and infrastructure projects, largely separated from any active intelligence gathering operation. But a much smaller number of prisoners, those judged to have unusually valuable knowledge, whether about military tactics, weapons technology. Submarine operations or high-level strategic planning were funneled instead into a specialized, classified interrogation system entirely separate from the general POW camp network. That specialized system needed a home secure enough to hold prisoners whose captivity itself needed to remain hidden from the German government, from the press, and in most cases from the American public as well. The US Army selected a site along the Potomac River in Virginia, just south of Washington, D.C., that had previously served other military purposes and converted it into what officially did not exist, a facility referred to internally by the deliberately anonymous designation P.O. Box 1142. Its true function classified at a level that required every person stationed there, guards, interrogators, translators, clerical staff to sign binding secrecy oaths with no defined expiration date. This is the detail worth sitting with before moving forward. The men who worked there didn't just keep a wartime secret during the war, which would be unremarkable. They kept it for the rest of their working lives through entire subsequent careers. Raising children who had no idea what their fathers had actually done during World War II, because the oath they signed never told them when or if they would ever be permitted to say otherwise. What actually happened inside that facility didn't become public knowledge because the government eventually declassified it in an orderly, planned release. It became public because a handful of the men who had worked there, entering their 80s and aware they were running out of time, decided the story needed to exist somewhere before they did. What they revealed changed how historians understood one of the most successful and least publicized intelligence operations of the Second World War. What actually happened at PO? Box 1142, the interrogation operation at Fort Hunt, formerly known within military intelligence circles by the designation Miss Y, held German prisoners considered too valuable for standard POW processing, captured U-boat crew members with knowledge of German naval technology and tactics, engineers and scientists with expertise relevant to weapons development, and at times higher-ranking officers whose knowledge of German strategic planning made them significant intelligence targets. The interrogation methods used at the site, as later confirmed by surviving veterans and by the US Army's own historical documentation, deliberately avoided the coercive or physically abusive interrogation practices that later became associated, in different contexts and different wars, with American military intelligence. Interrogators at Fort Hunt were trained instead in a psychological approach, building rapport, exploiting professional pride, engaging prisoners in seemingly casual technical conversation, where a prisoner might reveal genuinely valuable information without recognizing the significance of what he was disclosing. The facility's most historically significant technique, however, wasn't the direct interrogation sessions themselves, it was what happened afterward. Prisoners were housed, often in pairs, in cells wired with hidden microphones, on the theory that men who had just endured a formal interrogation session would often discuss what had happened, compare notes, or express genuine opinions to each other in what they believed was a private, unmonitored conversation. Those recorded conversations, transcribed by German-speaking American personnel listening in real time, frequently produced intelligence that direct interrogation alone never surfaced prisoners speaking candidly to a fellow German prisoner in ways they would never speak to an American officer across an interrogation table. The operation's success, measured by the volume and quality of intelligence it produced over the course of the war, was substantial enough that its existence remained one of American military intelligence's most tightly protected secrets well into the post-war decades, not because any of it was illegal or improper by the standards of the time, but because the specific methods. And the specific list of what German prisoners had actually revealed about their own military's capabilities and vulnerabilities retained genuine intelligence value for years after the war ended, particularly as the Cold War reshaped the strategic landscape and information about how to effectively interrogate a technologically sophisticated adversary became newly relevant again. It took a National Park Service historian working decades later on an unrelated project involving the history of the park grounds where the facility had once stood, to begin uncovering the story, tracking down surviving veterans, several by then in their 80s, and persuading a number of them that enough time had passed. And enough of what they'd done had already lost its operational sensitivity that they could finally speak. Their oral histories, recorded in the mid-2000s, became the primary public source confirming details about the facility's operations that had never appeared in any previously declassified document. What those interrogations and the hidden microphone recordings actually captured about individual German prisoners' experiences fighting Americans is only half of this story. The larger, more systematically documented body of evidence about how German military leadership assessed the US Army came from a different, even less publicized Program 1, that began only after the shooting stopped, when the US Army made the unusual decision to put some of its former enemies on its own payroll. The generals who wrote for the US Army in the years immediately following Germany's surrender in May 1945, the US Army's Historical Division, operating in occupied Europe, launched a program that would have seemed almost unthinkable a year earlier. It began systematically commissioning captured German military officers, including some of the highest-ranking generals of the entire war, to write detailed, analytical accounts of their own military campaigns, specifically framed around understanding how and why the German army had ultimately been defeated. The program's most significant figure was Franz Halder, who had served as chief of the German Army General Staff for the first years of the war, including the planning of the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, before being dismissed by Hitler in 1942 over strategic disagreements, and later imprisoned in a concentration camp after his loose connection to the 1944 plot against Hitler's life came under suspicion. After the war, Halder was recruited by the US Army's historical program to lead a systematic effort, eventually involving hundreds of former German officers, producing what became known as the Foreign Military Studies Collection, several thousand individual manuscripts, most written directly by the German commanders who had planned and led specific campaigns and battles against American and other Allied forces. The strategic logic behind the program, from the American Army's perspective, was straightforward and, in hindsight, remarkably far-sighted. As the Cold War began reshaping Europe's strategic landscape, American military planners recognized that no one understood the operational realities of fighting a modern mechanized war on European terrain better than the German officers who had just spent years doing exactly that, including, in a growing number of cases by the late 1940s, fighting against the same Soviet forces the United States now viewed as its primary future adversary. Understanding how German commanders had assessed American strengths and weaknesses in direct combat wasn't just a historical exercise. It was treated, at the time, as genuinely useful raw material for shaping how the US Army might need to fight in the future. What resulted was an unusually candid body of source material. These were not propaganda documents, and they weren't written for a German audience. They were technical, often self-critical assessments written by defeated commanders for the specific purpose of explaining, as accurately as they were willing and able, what had actually happened on the battlefield and why. Because the reports were produced independently by hundreds of different officers across dozens of different campaigns and theatres, with limited coordination between the authors, historians who have studied the collection in the decades since have treated recurring themes that appear across many separate, independently written reports as unusually credible, not because any single officer's account should be taken as definitive, but because a pattern repeated across a genuinely large number of unrelated authors is a meaningfully different kind of evidence than a single account or a single officer's opinion. Among the recurring observations that appear across a significant number of these independently written reports, one theme shows up disproportionately often when German commanders describe what specifically made American forces difficult to fight, and it's not the theme most people would expect from a defeated military describing the army that beat it. What kept showing up would be historically inaccurate and a genuine overstatement of the evidence. To claim that every single German account in the Foreign Military Studies collection said an identical thing about American forces, the collection spans thousands of documents written by officers with vastly different ranks, roles, campaigns and personal perspectives, describing combat across North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany itself, over several years of dramatically changing battlefield conditions. Historians who have worked directly with the archive are careful to note that no single, uniform German verdict on the American army exists in any simple sense. That said, a specific pattern does appear disproportionately often enough across independently authored reports that multiple historians studying the collection have identified it as a genuinely notable recurring theme, rather than a coincidence or a selection bias artifact of which documents happen to survive. German commanders, describing what surprised or frustrated them tactically about fighting American units, repeatedly noted a level of initiative and improvisation among comparatively junior American officers and even non-commissioned officers that stood in sharp contrast to the German army's own command culture, a culture built by design, around detailed advanced planning and a clear expectation that subordinate officers would execute a superior's plan precisely, with limited latitude to improvise independently when circumstances on the ground changed. American units, by multiple German accounts, behaved differently when a plan broke down, which in the chaos of actual combat happened constantly. Junior officers and sergeants, several reports noted, would frequently make independent tactical decisions on the spot, rather than waiting for orders to work back up a chain of command and a revised plan to work back down, adapting more quickly to unexpected battlefield conditions than German doctrine typically anticipated from an opposing army's lower-ranking personnel. Some German officers described this as a genuine tactical advantage for the Americans in fluid, rapidly changing combat situations, even while other reports from the same collection criticized American units for what German officers characterized, in more negative terms, as a comparative lack of rigid discipline or coordinated large unit maneuver compared to German formations at their most effective. Historians studying this pattern have connected it to a broader, independently documented difference in the two armies' training philosophies. German military doctrine, refined over decades of a professional officer corps tradition, emphasized what military historians often call mission-type tactics at the higher command level, giving field commanders broad strategic objectives and latitude in how to achieve them, but paired that with a much more rigid, top-down expectation of discipline and precise execution at the lower ranks. American military training and culture, shaped by a rapidly expanded wartime army, built substantially from civilian recruits rather than a small professional peacetime force, produced, according to this body of evidence, a comparatively flatter culture of individual initiative that extended further down the chain of command, a difference several of these independently written German reports appear to have noticed and found genuinely significant, even when their overall assessment of American forces was otherwise critical or dismissive. It's worth being precise about the limits of what this evidence actually proves. These are the documented perceptions and analytical judgments of a specific set of defeated German officers, writing years after the events they describe. For an American army audience, filtered through translation and through whatever selective memory and self-justification any veteran brings to an account of a war he lost. They are a genuinely valuable historical source, but they are not, on their own, objective proof of which army was tactically superior in some abstract sense. What they are is a rare, largely unclassified until recently body of evidence about how the enemy actually assessed American soldiers, in his own words, written for an audience that had no reason to want flattering answers, which is precisely what makes the recurring pattern across so many independent accounts worth taking seriously as a historical data point, even without treating it as the final word. This evidence sat in US Army archives, technically available to researchers with appropriate clearance for decades, but functionally obscure and rarely discussed outside a narrow circle of military historians until relatively recently, when a combination of archival digitization efforts and renewed public interest in declassified Cold War-era intelligence material brought both the Foreign Military Studies collection and the Fort Hunt interrogation program back into wider public awareness for the first time since the reports themselves were written. Why it stayed obscure for so long, neither the Fort Hunt interrogation program nor the Foreign Military Studies collection was, technically. A secret in the strictest legal sense for the entirety of the post-war period, significant portions of the foreign military studies documents were declassified and transferred to the National Archives decades ago, and the broad outline of the US Army's post-war use of German officers as historical consultants has been known to specialist military historians since at least the 1950s and 1960s. What kept both stories from reaching a wider public audience wasn't primarily active government suppression in the ongoing sense. It was a combination of quieter factors that cumulatively are worth understanding on their own terms. The Fort Hunt interrogators' individual, binding secrecy oaths had no automatic expiration date built into them, which meant the site's specific operational details depended entirely on individual veterans, decades later, independently deciding they were both willing and able to speak, rather than on any formal government declassification and release schedule. The Foreign Military Studies collection, meanwhile, while technically accessible, existed as thousands of individual, mostly untranslated manuscripts scattered across archival collections, genuinely obscure not because anyone was hiding it, but because reading and synthesizing it required a level of specialized historical and linguistic expertise that kept it largely confined to a small community of military historians for most of the collection's existence. Both stories, in other words, illustrate something slightly different from a classic hidden history narrative of active concealment. They illustrate how genuinely significant historical evidence can remain functionally invisible to the public for decades, not because anyone actively suppressed it, but because the mechanisms that would have made it broadly accessible declassification, with genuine public outreach, translation, digitization, media attention, simply never arrived until, in Fort Hunt's case. A handful of elderly veterans decided their own silence had outlived its purpose, and in the Foreign Military Studies collection's case, renewed historical and public interest in declassified Cold War material finally brought sustained attention to an archive that had been sitting, technically open, the entire time. What makes this story worth telling isn't a single smoking gun revelation. It's the accumulation of two separate, independently documented bodies of evidence, one gathered through secret wartime interrogation at a facility that officially didn't exist, the other gathered through an extraordinary post-war decision to put defeated enemy generals on the US Army's own payroll to explain, in their own words. Exactly how they'd been beaten that together give historians something rare. A genuine, largely primary source record of how the German military actually assessed American soldiers, rather than how American soldiers or American propaganda assessed themselves. The pattern that recurs across so many of those independently written reports that American forces, whatever their other tactical shortcomings by German standards, produced a level of individual initiative among junior officers and enlisted men that German doctrine simply hadn't been built to expect, isn't a triumphant, simple story. It's a specific, documented, historically significant observation made by the people who had the most direct professional reason to study American forces critically and the least incentive to flatter them. It took a group of interrogators willing to break 61 years of silence and a collection of German generals' manuscripts sitting quietly in an archive for decades, for that observation to become something the public could actually read for themselves. If you want to look into the primary sources, the Fort Hunt Oral History Project conducted by the National Park Service and the US Army's Foreign Military Studies collection held at the National Archives and the US Army Heritage and Education Center, I've linked what's publicly available in the description. This is documented, verifiable, and largely still under-examined by the wider public. It didn't need a single invented detail to earn its place in this channel's archive.